Hey, good morning, everyone. So as many of you can imagine, I changed my talk a little bit yesterday afternoon to address some concerns. So bear with me a little bit because I haven't gone through it as much as I would have liked to go through it prior to today's talk. But today I'm going to talk about the use of fasting in a clinical setting. So disclosures. So I am the president and co-founder of the Intensive Dietary Management Program. We're based out of Toronto, Ontario, up in Canada. We use a combination of time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting, prolonged periods of fasting, low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets in the treatment of our patients. So we have an online component, but today I'm going to talk about what we actually do in our clinic. So I love starting off with this slide. This slide is actually gifted to me by one of my patients who's a very talented graphic designer. So she's an in-office patient. And for those of you who don't know, my colleague here, Dr. Jason Fung, he's a big Star Wars fan. So we often joke in Toronto that he's a Yoda of fasting. So in my face here, she's stuck on the body of a guinea pig. And that's because I was actually the first person that agreed to do therapeutic fasting. I had metabolic syndrome. I was in really rough shape at a very young age. And I've worked with Jason Fung actually for 19 years this May. We work in a nephrology practice. He's a nephrologist, which is a kidney specialist. And I've always done clinical research in the field of nephrology. So I was diagnosed with diabetes, and I'll share a little bit about my own journey at the end. But I was the initial guinea pig, so I started experimenting with fasting. I got great results, and then all of our patients said, "Hey, what the heck are you doing? You're looking great, your energy's up, I want to do that too." And that's really how we started the Intensive Dietary Management Program. So today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about our patient demographics. I'm going to talk about the safety and the importance of selecting the appropriate fasting regimen for our patients. I'll run over some of our fasting protocols, and I'll touch base on some common concerns with fasting. Now, Jason, he always talks about why we fast and the benefits of fasting. So today I'm going to touch base a little bit more on the practical aspects of fasting and how we actually run our clinic in Toronto. So we started using therapeutic fasting in June of 2013. I saw my first therapeutic fasting patient on June 5th, 2013. And by July 1st, Canada Day, was the last day he took insulin. So since June of 2013, in clinic, we have treated over 5,000 patients with some form of fasting, whether it be time-restricted eating windows, where you simply just don't eat between meals and you don't snack in the evening time, or we've used various intermittent fasting regimens and extended fasting. Over 70% of these 5,000 plus patients that we've treated in clinic, they've had some degree of diabetes. So they either present in consultation with borderline diabetes, or we once had a woman present in clinic on over 600 units of insulin, plus 4 oral anti-hyperglycemic medications. She was taking all 4 of those medications on the maximum dose, and her A1C was 11.7. So that was in 2015. I can say in 2018, she's off of all of that stuff. Her A1C is in the 6, it's around 6.1 or 6.2. So we're still working on it, but we've come a long way. Some of our patients just reach out to us for disease prevention. So about less than 10% of our patient population, they have a strong family history of cardiovascular disease or diabetes, all insulin-resistant related issues, and they don't want to suffer as they get older. They want to learn lifestyle interventions today to prevent disease. So we also treat some very healthy individuals in our clinic. So our clinic is quite diverse in its patient population. So let me talk to you a little bit about the profile of our typical IDM patient, because I want you guys to understand when Jason and I, when we write books, when we write blog posts, and when we talk in podcasts, I want you to understand the population of patients we're actually addressing. So the majority of the patients in our program in clinic, they're over the age of 40. Many of them are over the age of 60. They're very sedentary, or they just keep up with their day-to-day activities of running their household and taking care of their children. The majority of our patients actually exercise less than 3 times a week. They all have some sort of history of metabolic syndrome in their family, or they're suffering from metabolic syndrome. The majority of them are also on antihypertensive medications and statins, and they almost always have one secondary side effect of diabetes. So we have a lot of diabetic nephropathy. Being a kidney clinic, first and foremost, we see a lot of diabetic kidney disease. We see a lot of diabetic neuropathy, diabetic eye disease, tons of amputations. So a lot of our patients are struggling with more than just metabolic syndrome. The socioeconomic profile of our patient is very important when to take into consideration what we do with them and the protocols that we assign to them. Jason and I, we practice in Toronto, Ontario. Toronto is the most multiculturally diverse city in the world. We're also tied for the 3rd largest city in North America. Where Jason and I work within the city of Toronto, we work in a borough called Scarborough. And Scarborough has great, substantial socioeconomic diversity. The majority of our patients are not as blessed. Most of them are very, very sick when they present to us in clinic. They're on short-term or long-term disability because they can no longer keep up with their day-to-day activities. So these people are on a very, very strict set income, very fixed income. So a lot of our patients who are on short-term or long-term disability, they're given $700 to $900 a month to survive on. The cost of living in Toronto is very similar to that of Vancouver, San Francisco, and New York City. We are not a cheap place to live, but people live in Toronto because we have substantial opportunity for individual and personal growth within the city because we are such a large city. So these people on this fixed income, they have to buy food, clothing, pay for housing, transportation. A lot of the times, these patients will tell me buying produce, fresh produce, is a special treat for them. They can maybe afford it a few days out of each month, but they're sort of stuck living off of rice, potatoes, pasta, and all of these starchy foods that are not necessarily the best foods to have when you're trying to manage your diabetes. We also have a lot of newcomers to Canada. Over 50% of the city of Toronto was not born in Canada. So we have a lot of patients who are living with relatives and are depending on them financially to help them get situated within Canada, or they're just struggling on their own. They have no family there, and they're trying to support their families. Their degrees don't transfer to Toronto. They have to re-educate themselves. So they can't place that financial burden on their families. So they tend to still have to eat a diet of rice and potatoes and pasta and bread. So we were really struggling. When Jason and I wanted to start using therapeutic fasting in our clinic, we received a lot of negative feedback from our colleagues, and they pretty much said, no, we're going to kick you guys out on the street. Fasting was very controversial back in 2013. So we tried working on a low carbohydrate diet with our patients, and we just didn't get anywhere. It's not that they didn't want to eat better, but they just couldn't afford to eat better. So is there hope? Yes, absolutely. So we begged and pleaded with our colleagues and our peers in Toronto to let us start fasting these patients. And the beauty about fasting this patient demographic is they're not buying food every day. They're only eating every other day. So that frees up a lot of their food budget, right? So when they go to buy foods, they can afford to buy better quality foods. So fasting for them is much of a blessing. So where they might have not been able to afford that head of broccoli, last year was like $10 a head in Toronto, they can maybe do that because they're not eating every day. So we enable them to make better food selections. So a lot of people always ask us too, do you start your patients off with a low carb or ketogenic diet, or do you just push them right into fasting? Just throw them in the deep end there. Well, common sense dictates that if you're in a ketogenic state, fasting would be a lot easier. Now, when I first started fasting, low carb was not accepted. Back in 2013, it was just starting to gain some popularity in the medical field. But I grew up eating like garbage. I was born in 1984. I never had good eating habits. From the day I was born, I was fed pablum, the primary ingredient was cornstarch. I grew up in a generation where I was told to eat every 8 hours, never really, or 8 times a day, eat every hour that I was awake. And all of the foods where I was encouraged to snack, I was encouraged to eat sugar for breakfast. That's the era I grew up in. So I had no idea how to eat healthy. I had never, in 27 years when I first started fasting, ever had any good eating habits. So for me, it was just easier not to eat than to figure out how to eat well at the time. But when you start fasting, your insulin levels decline. And as your insulin levels decline, your hunger hormone level, your primary hunger hormone level, ghrelin, also starts to decline. So when you're not in this constant state of hunger with these high hormonal levels, you have a lot more control over your impulses when it comes to food. So actually jumping in and starting off with fasting controlled me hormonally so I could be more sensible and have more control over my foods. And over time, I started low carb very successfully, and I've been ketogenic for the better part of the last 3 years, very successfully. So you can really start with either or. Nowadays, in 2017, 2018, there's such a great acceptance among the medical community on low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets, and family members are more supportive of their significant others and their parents, sisters, and brothers who want to do a low carbohydrate diet. So I would experiment and see what works for you. If you're new to fasting and you want to start, you can try a low carbohydrate diet to get your hormones under control, to make fasting easier, but you'll have just as much success if you jump in and start fasting. So what are the main things that we treat in our clinic in Toronto? Obesity, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is surprisingly the easiest thing that we found to treat with therapeutic fasting. Within about 4 to 6 months with a compliant patient, we can almost get rid of even severe fatty liver disease. It's pretty astonishing. We also treat polycystic ovarian syndrome. We've had several IDM babies, actually a lot of IDM babies. That's all thanks to my colleague Nadia. She spends most of her time working with those women. And because of her, we have this whole cluster of IDM babies now from women who thought otherwise they weren't going to be able to have them. We also treat some sleep apnea. So we've been able to, over the last 5 years, take about a dozen people off of their CPAP machines, which isn't bad. We're still working on it and figuring out the right protocols, but I'd say that's a pretty good start in the treatment of sleep apnea. So pretty much everything we treat is all-encompassing of insulin resistance. So in our clinic today, Dr. Jason Fung and myself are trying to learn about other ways that therapeutic fasting may benefit different diseases. So we're experimenting with therapeutic fasting in different kinds of cancers and also different kinds of benign tumor growths. So we have a whole cluster of women now we're working with who have prolactinomas. So when you have a prolactinoma, it's a tumor on your pituitary gland that tricks your body into thinking that you're pregnant. So you can't actually get pregnant because your body thinks that you're pregnant. So we're working with these group of women, and so far we've had some good success. So we look forward to publishing our research in the future. We also are seeing how fasting might affect different neurological conditions. So many of our patients with diabetic neuropathy have noted huge improvements in their neuropathy. So we're exploring how therapeutic fasting really can help or potentially benefit neuropathy patients. We've also started to see some patients with multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease. We also work with some patients with autoimmune disease, primary Crohn's disease, and we've had some really good success there. In more recent months, we started working with a lot of high-performance professional athletes, which has been really cool. We've definitely had to change our protocols for these people. So one thing I really want you guys to keep in mind during the rest of my talk is our patient demographic. So we are not fasting high-performance athletes on a day-to-day basis. We have 12 in about 5,000 patients. So when Jason and I share our fasting protocols, share our protein recommendations, we're talking about the majority of our patient population. We're not talking about the 12 patients that are actively training twice a day for 90 minutes, 7 days of the week, where their livelihood depends on their athletic performance. So when we treat these individuals, now that we've started, we would never do any insane fasting regimen with these patients. We usually cap them to about 16 hours, and occasionally we go really wild and limit them to 24 hours. But we never would ever fast them for something like 28 or 38 days. They do not have the body fat to support that duration of fast on a regular basis. So that's one thing I want you to keep in mind throughout this talk is our patient demographic. It is very different than many of our other colleagues who have presented at this conference today. We have very sick, very sedentary people. They are not active, they're not out doing weight training all of the time. They're not high performance athletes. So please keep that in mind. So what is considered therapeutic fasting? What the heck are we doing up there in the Great White North? So therapeutic fasting can be simple as time-restricted eating. In Toronto, we actually had extreme acceptance for fasting because our city is so culturally diverse. We'll have a patient come in for consultation, and we'll talk to them about fasting, and they'll say, well, heck yes, let's do it. You know, I fast every year for Ramadan. You want me to fast 3 times a week? That's easy. That's nothing like Ramadan, or they're Hindu and they'd fast a couple times a week and then special fast once a month. So we have had a lot of success with patients being very agreeable to fasting, but sometimes they're not, or sometimes they're just too sick, or they pose high risk for refeeding syndrome. So if a patient meets the criteria where they might be susceptible to developing refeeding syndrome after a fast, we just focus with time-restricted eating. That means they eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they just don't snack. So it's not like they're going for significant periods of fasting, maybe at most 13 or 14 hours from the time they finish dinner to the time they woke up in the morning. It's very important you don't fast people for extended periods of time when they're a high-risk patient. For patients who are more accepted or more comfortable fasting, we might just start them off doing sort of a 16-8 or an 18-6 fast. That means that they skip 1 meal a day. So they'll either have breakfast and lunch and skip dinner, or they'll have lunch and dinner and they'll skip breakfast that day. Typically, we use intermittent fasting protocols with our patients, so 24, 36, or 42 hours of intermittent fasting. And we found the frequency that we need to get decent, consistent results with our patients is about 3 times a week. It appears that once to twice a week just has more of a maintenance response where they're able to balance out the patient's diet, where they might have eaten out and had more carbs than they wanted or had hidden carbs in their diet, or they ate a little bit more and ate past satiation a few times that week. But once to twice a week is good for maintenance. But to really see consistent progress on a week-to-week basis, we will ask our patients to fast about 3 times per week. So that's the magic frequency of these intermittent fasts that we found worked best at our clinic over the last 5 years. Now, with the right patient and with medical supervision, we will recommend prolonged periods of fasting. The longest we allow a patient to fast for is 14 days. These patients are not at risk for refeeding syndrome, or we would not fast them for that long in the first place. They are very well hydrated and encouraged to take electrolytes, and I'll talk to you about what is permitted during a fast in some follow-up slides. So we watch them very carefully. We check their blood work very frequently during this fast too, to see what happens to their electrolytes, to make sure that they're not becoming depleted of very important electrolytes like sodium, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, things that might lead to refeeding syndrome. So we're very cautious. We also don't recommend prolonged fasts all of the time. We found that consistency is key with our patients. So intermittent fasting is just a lot more flexible. Every week of the year, I cannot fast for 5 days. I've got my mother's birthday, my husband and I want to go out on a date night, I have a business lunch. It's impossible to keep up these prolonged periods of fasting all of the time. So intermittent fasting is generally what our patients do. But periodically, for the right patient, we will fast them anywhere from 2 to 14 days. So maybe once, sort of every 4 to 8 weeks, but not something that we usually recommend on a consistent basis. So how do we determine what is the right and what is the safe fasting protocol for patients? So there's different considerations we have to take into account when directing our patients towards what fasting regimen might be best for them. So medical considerations. So again, once or twice a week of intermittent fasting is usually what we do for sort of disease prevention or for maintenance mode. So for someone who comes to our clinic, for those really healthy people that come to us and say, we just want to stay healthy, we would recommend that they do a 24-hour fast once or twice a week. For patients who are looking to actively treat some sort of condition, we have them fast 3 times a week. So various intermittent fasting protocols we recommend. The first one is a 24-hour fast. So you'd essentially fast from dinner tonight until dinner tomorrow, or lunch today until lunch tomorrow, a 24-hour period of time. We usually recommend this fasting regimen from people who don't have that much body fat to lose. So they're looking to lose their last 25, 30 pounds, nothing substantial. We also recommend this to people who are borderline diabetic, people who are diabetic and aren't on any diabetic medications yet, and also to those who are very ill. You never want to fast someone for a significant period of time when they're combating all kinds of health issues. So a person on dialysis places a lot of stress on the body, and also dialysis patients are restricted to their fluid intake. We don't want to risk them becoming dehydrated. So we would work them up to doing a 24-hour fast from time-restricted eating, but we would cap them at 24 hours. So for those who are really ill or those who are in the midst of combating some sort of other major condition, we block them at fasting for 24 hours. So again, you've got to take all these things in consideration. You can't fast someone who's got less than 10% body fat for 30 days. You can't fast someone with congestive heart failure on fluid restriction for 30 days. So it's about being very smart and very cautious and working your way up, assessing your patients very frequently to see how their individual body is responding. Sometimes in our clinic, we see patients weekly. There was one patient that I saw twice a week for about 2 months to make sure we were doing what was best for them. Now back to the intermittent fast. 36 and 42 hours intermittent fasting is usually what we would recommend to a more healthy patient population, but they're looking to lose more weight. They have a substantial amount of body fat. They're definitely not malnourished, and they're diabetic. They tend to be on multiple medications for their diabetes, but they're not combating anything else major. They're not on dialysis. They don't have any health restrictions on their fluid intake. Mental considerations are also important to take into consideration. So when I meet a patient in consultation, I spend a significant amount of time with them, getting to understand their medical history, but getting to know them and their lifestyle. So I'll start talking to them about things like the history of their body image. So it's important to note whether these patients have had an eating disorder, whether that's binge eating, anorexia nervosa, or bulimia, or if they've been bullied for their weight, either by peers at school, friends, family members, their spouse. It's important to sort of understand how they feel about their body. We have found people with a history of negative body image tend to be a little bit more obsessive compulsive about getting to a healthier place. So they will go to the extreme side of things. If you tell them that it's safe for them to fast for 7 days once, they'll want to do it all of the time because they're so emotionally connected to their weight and what that scale says and what size clothes they are. They're not really thinking very clearly about their state of their health. So for these people, we would just simply start fasting them with time-restricted eating, just fasting them between meals, working their way up, having small little victories, where they develop a better sense of their health and their body image. We do the same thing with those who have a history of addictive behaviors and substance abuse, because they tend to take things to the extreme side too. So we would start them off with time-restricted eating or 16 or 18 hours of fasting. So it's very important to understand your patient's history. Family history is another important consideration. I had one patient, he moved to Canada from Vietnam. He had a very good life in Canada, and he definitely indulged in all of the good food that we have in the city of Toronto, and that eventually led to diabetes. But he grew up in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and he grew up in extreme famine. So for him, At first, this was when we first started IDM, we weren't asking these questions. And we realized that he grew up sort of in extreme famine, and he was very malnourished as a child. Now, he definitely wasn't malnourished when we were fasting him, but he has post-traumatic stress from his upbringing. So when we saw him, he was on quite a lot of insulin, but otherwise he was pretty healthy. So we thought, all right, let's try to get him off insulin as fast as possible. So we started doing some more prolonged fasts with him. And this triggered a little bit of post-traumatic stress, and he would end up binge eating, and the fast would be very counterproductive. Likewise, I have patients who grew up in a bit of poverty. Now they're very successful. They have a substantial amount of food. They're very well nourished today. So when we would talk to them, we'd say, okay, if you want to do a 3-day fast, go for it. That's perfectly fine. But then we learn about their upbringing, growing up on food stamps, not having access to food, suffering from malnourishment, and then we see binge eating. So it's important to ask your patients these questions. It's important to get to know them, just sort of beyond what diabetic medications, what blood pressure medications they're taking. Also, their allosteric load. How much stress are they under? And do they have a history of stress eating? When I first started fasting, my life was in shambles. It was not a good time. I was going through a demise of a 12-year relationship. I just finished school and didn't quite know where I was going in life. I was becoming ill. I had to move in with my parents temporarily. I love them, but I don't love living with them. So life was very stressful. So when Jason and I were talking, he said, what about maybe starting off with a 7-day fast? And I said, for someone who's eaten 8 times a day for their entire lives and who's never had a proper meal, I think that would be too much stress on my body right now, given all of the other stress that I have going on in my life. So I started off doing sort of 18-6 and 24 hours of fasting and letting my body adapt to being in a fasted state. So then if I did decide I wanted to fast longer, it wouldn't be such a huge stressor on my body. So considering their stress load, I've also found with patients, when their life is in shambles, they want to take control of their health because they need to get control of something, and their eating, their weight, those are the things that they feel that they can take control of. So when school's crazy, work's crazy, family relationships are all in shambles, they need to find control over something. So a lot of them come to us in consultation, and they're just hanging on by a thread. I had this one young woman, 23 years old, last March actually, she reached out to me in consultation, lovely girl, and they started asking her these questions. Well, she was 2 months out from finishing her master's degree, 3 months out from getting married, and the anniversary of her mother's death was also about 3 months out. She had a lot on her plate. Her stress level was through the roof. I encouraged her to wait till after her wedding and when she completed her master's to reach out to me to start fasting, because I actually thought the fasting would be counterproductive given her current high state of stress. She was adamant that she was going to do this with or without my assistance. So I said, well, I might as well follow her along to make sure she's doing it safely, and hopefully I can talk her out of it. Well, she never really ended up fasting until after her wedding anyways. It was too stressful on her body. When she would fast, she wouldn't get any of the benefits that she was looking for with fasting, and she actually found it to be quite negative. So once everything was done and over with, in the summertime, we started fasting. She was able to do it quite successfully, getting the results that she wanted. And now, a year later, she's achieved all of her results, and she's moved on from our program. Lifestyle considerations are important, too. What are their work environments like? So what are their jobs like? Are they high stress? Do they have lots of lunch meetings and dinner meetings? Do they work in an open space environment where they have colleagues constantly stuffing their face with potato chips all day long? So these are important things to take into consideration too. And family support. Their families, their spouse, might not like the idea of them not having dinner with them on a more regular basis. So it's about finding the right fasting regimen that not only is suitable for them mentally and physically, but is also suitable for their lifestyle. Are they the chef at home? How can we work with that in their fasting to find the optimal fasting level? What about their kids? How old are their kids? Is mealtime important? Or are their kids so busy with extracurricular activities every evening of the week that they don't have time to eat well? So we see a lot of parents that come into our program mid-40s. They've got a 7 and a 10-year-old with ballet class, gymnastics, soccer, hockey, baseball, the whole shebang. And they've gotten sick because they've lived off of fast food. Easy to go to fast food because they don't have time to eat well. So this kind of person, so middle age, not very sick, just starting to develop medical complications from metabolic syndrome. These are the people that do better doing a little bit more prolonged periods of fasting, because then they don't have to worry about eating. And also the physical activity. So for our patients who are more active, we do definitely adjust their fasting regimens down, not up, and we adjust their protein accordingly. So we are not a one-size-fits-all program, and we always get niched like this. So this is really why I'm happy to speak here today, to sort of explain how our program works. So other dietary recommendations, some patients just aren't willing to go low carb. We definitely push everyone towards a low carb or ketogenic diet if they're willing to, but at least eliminating refined carbohydrates from their diet, and at the very least eliminating snacking between meals. So what do our patients consume during a fast? Water. Water is a biggie. We encourage patients to drink whenever they're thirsty. There's no defined amount for anyone. Drink when you're thirsty. Salt, electrolytes, very important. So each patient, we work with them individually on guiding them towards the right dosage of electrolytes. There is not a one-size-fits-all recommendation, which I think is really scary when I read a lot of this stuff online. We have some high-performance athletes. We have some patients with stage 5 kidney disease. You have to be cautious. Bone broth is another thing we recommend, especially when a person is trying to do a 7-day fast or longer. We never recommend that someone who's doing a prolonged fast of 7 days or longer just sticks to water and salt. We want you to get phosphorus, we want you to get other minerals and electrolytes, and bone broth is a great way to do that. Magnesium, like Evelyn said in her last talk, and I think Ivor kicked off the magnesium talk a little bit on Friday, magnesium plays a big role. So our patients are encouraged to take magnesium, intermittent fasts, prolonged fasts, eating days, magnesium all the time. Tea and coffee. Patients are allowed to consume tea and coffee, preferably black, but when they're new to fasting, we do permit them to put a little bit of fat, less than 3 tablespoons of fat, during a fasting period into their tea and coffee, just to help them acclimate to being in a fasting state. We never really kick anyone in the butt to get them into fasting. So I'm briefly going to touch base on some concerns that were brought up during yesterday's talk about fasting, and these are common concerns that Jason and I hear about all of the time. So first I'm going to talk about electrolytes. In 5 years, we have yet to have an issue with electrolyte depletion or electrolyte insufficiency. So electrolytes, the important ones that we take into consideration are sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. So sodium and chloride are salts. We do recommend patients take salt during a fast, and that varies. It's very custom. It depends on the person's activity level and their health history. So we adjust the amount of salt that our patients take based on their health needs. And we do recommend that patients take some good quality Himalayan salt or Celtic salt throughout their fast. Salt's very important because as you start fasting and cutting out the carbs, your insulin levels go down. And that causes your kidneys to release all kinds of water and all kinds of salt. So we definitely don't want to have any issues with refeeding syndrome. So we really recommend salt, but that has to be very individual. All the other ones, potassium. We check patients' blood all of the time. When someone does a 7-day fast, we might check it 2 or 3 times during that 7-day fast. We do find that potassium levels change, but they might go from 4.5 millimoles per liter to 4.3 millimoles per liter. The change is very minor, and not once has anyone ever dropped below the normal range. Not once in 5 years. Doesn't mean we might never see it, but we're really optimistic that it's not going to be a future issue. Magnesium, we recommend it to everyone. Citrate or glycinate, we start out, like Evelyn said, at about 400 milligrams a day, and we work up from there. Calcium and phosphorus, they remain stable during a fast. So this guy here we're about to talk about, I have a couple slides on him, is Angus Barbieri. He's that lunatic that fasted for 382 days. But he was not one malnourished guy. He started out at 456 pounds. But he fasted very smart. He was given nutrients via IV very frequently during this fast. So the top graph here, you'll see his magnesium levels definitely dropped within the first 50 days of his fast. But they stabilized at the lower end of the normal range, but never did they really drop below the normal range. Same thing with calcium, potassium levels. Minor shifts, but all within the normal range. So the number one rule about fasting is never, ever, ever fast someone who is malnourished. This man was not malnourished. And this is our patient population. Our patient population is not those of less than 10% body fat. Our patient population is those who are suffering from obesity. So this is a recommended guidelines from the NIH on identifying patients who are at high risk for refeeding problems. So these patients, if someone presented in consultation that had very little body fat, who had any sort of severe electrolyte deficiencies, we would simply just work on their diet with them to start, cutting out snacking. So you just can't have anyone fast willy-nilly. So refeeding syndrome usually occurs about 2 days after extended fast being about 5 days or longer, and it's just when the electrolytes, especially phosphorus, get very depleted. It's prone to occur in patients who are malnourished and don't have sufficient fat stores. That is not our patient population, so that's important to keep in mind. So refeeding prevention. Do not do prolonged periods of water fasting. So we never fast anyone on water and salt only beyond 7 days. We need our patients to remain hydrated, we need them to take their electrolytes, and we need them to keep up the regular activities during this time to prevent refeeding syndrome. Very few people have the luxury of spending 14 days laying on their butt. So it's not something that's a grave concern for us. The loss of lean mass, which I think is the thing I've been tagged on the most since yesterday morning on social media. But to reiterate Dr. Finney's answers for most of his Q&A questions, was we need more data. We simply need more data on the effects of prolonged fast. I know Fung says stuff, I know Finney says stuff. They're both brilliant men, lots of respect for both of them. They both have very different patient populations, wouldn't you say? You know, Finney's focused a lot of his career on high-performance athletes. We focus a lot of our career on, couch potatoes. So it's a very different patient population. We have sick people that would love to be high-performance athletes, but they're just too sick to get off the couch. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of our clinical observations when it comes to lean mass loss. And what we've seen has just been really cool. We've only seen lean mass gain, which is really awesome. So we are, thank you. We are actively collecting data. I have a team of medical students who I drive crazy on a regular basis doing research for us. So hopefully within the next couple of years, we'll get some of these publications out. We're 5 years young, so we just have now sufficient data to support publishing some research. So this is a clinical example that I'm going to give today. A 53-year-old female. She's been fasting for about 2 years. Once a month, she does a 96-hour water and salt only fast. The rest of the days of the month, she varies between 16 and 24 hours of fasting daily. She does quite intense weight training twice a week. Like, she could bench press me with her right finger. I'm pretty confident about that. And she's been on a ketogenic diet for the better part of 4 years. Because she's so intense with her exercise, we definitely have her adjust her protein up to support her lean muscle mass and the development of future lean muscle gain. So this is her DEXA scan results she was allowed me to present today. She did 2 DEXA scans about 4.5 months apart last year, one in March and one in July. And you'll see on her comparison, she kept up with her fasting. She works out, whether she's in a water fasted state or an intermittent fasting state. She gained 4.1 lean pounds of body mass within a 4.5 month window. That's freaking awesome. And she lost 1 pound of body fat. So she's kicking butt. And she's in her 50s. So we see this all the time. I can't tell you the number of 75-year-old men that come in and flex their big pipes for me. They said they never got to do it in their 20s, so they had to do it for a young lady before they died. So I see some cool stuff in clinic. So this is a more recent study. And to reiterate the great Dr. Finney, I'm a huge fan of his. But to reiterate his answers yesterday, there needs to be more research on the effects of prolonged fasting. Totally get that. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about what we've seen in the literature about alternate daily fasts in lean mass. I'm going to be quick, Jeff. So this is a randomized controlled trial. They did alternate daily fasting of 0 calories and daily caloric restriction, where they reduced the patients from about 2,500 calories a day to 2,000 calories a day and assessed them over 32 weeks. They both lost about the same weight, but what was interesting was the kind of weight that they lost. So their total fast percentage in the low-calorie group, or the calorie restriction group, was only down 0.7%, whereas in the alternate daily fasting group, their total body fat percentage was down 2.4%. With their trunk fat mass percentage, so trunk fat, that's all your visceral fat, that's all that disease-causing fat. In the calorie restriction group, we only saw it down 0.3%, but in alternate daily fasting, we saw it down 1.8%. And now on to lean mass. In the calorie restricted group, we saw their lean mass go up about by 0.5%. And when your body fat goes down, your lean mass is going to go up. But it only went up about 0.5% in this calorie restricted group. But in the alternate daily fasting group, it went up by 2.2%. So even though during periods of fasting, you will have some protein breakdown for gluconeogenesis, but you have substantial growth hormone. So you replace old muscle with new muscle. So hopefully, we will be part of presenting greater research in the future on lean mass. To combat metabolic rates in these groups, so I'll talk about it quickly. The calorie-restricted group, their metabolic rate dropped by 76.1 kilocalories over the 32 weeks, which had a p-value of 0.045. That means it's quite a substantial drop in their resting metabolic rate. But in the alternate daily fasting group, it only dropped by about 29.2 kilocalories per day with a p-value of 0.416, which is not clinically significant. And if you look at the actual numbers, alternate daily fasting group went from 1,689 to 1,659.8, which really is not that substantial over 32 weeks. So just a little bit about myself. I was a chunky monkey. I was diagnosed with, I was always that skinny fat girl, and I never knew that till in my mid-20s. But I was diagnosed with fatty liver at 12, PCOS at 14, blowed all my doctors' minds. We have this girl with a BMI less than 18. How can she have all these diseases of obesity at such a young age? They told me not to worry about it. I grew out of it since I was skinny. But I was a skinny little sack of fat. In my adult years, I became a very large sack of fat. My body fat actually shot up to over 61%. I gained nearly 100 pounds over a year and a half. All of those McNuggets that I ate, all that insulin damage I did caught up with me when I was 26. 27, I was diagnosed with diabetes. And I also had osteoporosis, I'm guessing from bad things that were in my diet. So I was just a big sack of fat. I started off doing intermittent fasting, 24 hours. I graduated to 42 hours. And eventually I found that 72 hours worked best for my lifestyle. I moved into a ketogenic diet, and I really focused on time-restricted eating windows to get my success. At 6 months, I lost 60 pounds. My A1C went to 4.6%. For the first time in my life since I was 12 years old, I did not have fatty liver disease. And I started having a regular menstrual cycle for the first time in my life. I'm 6 years out. I'm down 80 pounds, which is pretty cool. Fasting is a great tool to have in my pocket for when those days where I eat that whole 16-ounce steak. I'm 5'1". That's a lot of steak for me, but I can do it. My A1C in January this year was 4.5 after a 3-week vacation in Florida with my husband. No fatty liver or PCOS. I've had regular, consistent menstrual periods for the last 6 years, and I have osteopenia. It's borderline osteopenia, so I'm still working on that. So if you want to learn more about our program, here's a bunch of information and ways to connect with us on social media. Thank you, guys.